2015 presidential election divided Americans in ways unseen in a generation. Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump polarized Americans into two seemingly unreconcilable camps. But from the outset, that's not what people thought would happen at all. From the beginning, people thought that Hillary Clinton would simply embark on her coronation march to the presidency. People thought that she simply had too many connections and simply had too many resources and would simply overcome a too-fractured Republican opposition to win the presidential nomination easily. But after presidential Donald Trump won in the Electoral College, we see now that that's not what was going to happen at hand. And instead, we must look to a reason for Hillary Clinton's loss and come up with the understanding that Hillary Clinton was defeated because of her campaign's inability to come up with a resolute plan to counter Donald Trump's unnatural and unconventional campaign style. The fact that Hillary Clinton's camp simply was all talk about how they should counter Donald Trump's campaign and was unable to implement those into actions on the ground meant that she was defeated. And was what came to mind when I read the adage, when all is said and done, a lot more is said than done. By this, it is meant that we must work hard to make sure that talk is transferred into action. And this can be seen today by looking to three examples. First, we must look to the example of Holden Caulfield. Next, we must look to the example of communist revolutionary Vladimir Lenin. And finally, we must look to the example of South African President F.W. de Klerk. And by looking to all of these, we can see exactly why you must work hard to make sure your words are transferred into actions so as to come out ahead in the end. Holden Caulfield is the protagonist of J.D. Salinger's great American novel, The Catcher in the Rye. In this book, Holden Caulfield is expelled from Pensy Prep, the preparatory academy which he once attended, and then proceeds to wander the streets of New York, trying to find someone, anyone, to listen to his story and to his fears about growing up and becoming an adult in the real world. Throughout the novel, Holden talks to a taxi cab driver, a prostitute, and even a nun. But throughout the novel, no one listens to him and to his fears about becoming a grown-up. Ultimately, he becomes more and more despondent, and by the end of the story, winds up in a mental institution as a result. Holden Caulfield's failure in the story comes about as a result of his failure to translate his fears and his desires into actual actions. He's all talk in the story, but he doesn't translate that talk into actually doing anything. Ultimately, this means that he's unable to accomplish his goals, unable to realize success, and so shows us how we should do the opposite in our lives if we wish to come out on top. An example of someone who did the opposite, who realized their goals by translating their talk into action, was Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the Bolshevik Party during the Russian Revolution. Vladimir Lenin was born into petty Russian nobility around the turn of the 20th century. In this station, Vladimir Lenin held a position of authority and security in the Tsarist Russian regime at the time. He didn't want for anything in this rigid Russian system. But when his brother was killed trying to assassinate the Russian emperor, he realized that there was a much wider world out there, and that the Russian peasantry was starving and suffering. And so he decided to become a leftist revolutionary, and he joined Russia's fledgling communist movement. He soon realized, however, that this communist movement in Russia was largely all talk, and was composed of many like him, people of high social standing who met to convene to discuss how the peasants were suffering, but didn't want to do anything about it. And so Lenin decided he would change all that, and he founded the Bolshevik Party, one of the few movements at the time who was actually embarking to co-opt socialist change on the ground. This movement would soon start the Russian Revolution during World War I, and would become the movement that would take over Russia in the 1920s and found the Soviet Union, one of the world's two superpowers during the Cold War. And finally, we must look to the example of yet another man who was able to translate talk into action and so change the world. F.W. de Klerk was the last white president of South Africa. F.W. de Klerk ruled over a nation on the edge. The whites who had ruled apartheid-era South Africa realized that their system that kept the white minority in power and the black majority oppressed couldn't stand forever, and had begun a long series of talks about what they could do to change the system in a way that meant that their privileges would not be abridged. But that's all they've been doing for more than 2 decades, was talking. De Klerk realized that the longer they kept up this regimen of simply talking, the closer their regime would come to falling not on their terms. And so he begun a dialogue with Nelson Mandela, the imprisoned leader of the African National Congress, and so begun the negotiations that would actually lead to free and fair elections in South Africa. Thus, he begun the process of opening South Africa up to black rule and started a South Africa that was free and fair for all people. And so today, we have looked at the quotation, "When all is said and done, a lot more is said than done," and have seen by looking at the examples of Holden Caulfield, Vladimir Lenin, and F.W. de Klerk, that ultimately this means you have to work hard to make sure that talk is translated into action to find success in the end.